Let's go live now to Goulburn in New South Wales. The Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor joins me. Thanks for your time. You heard what Jim Chalmers said there. Let's get through a few of the things, but let's start with the whole idea of reining in tax concessions for super balances $3 million and above. What's wrong with that idea?
Well, first of all, Kieran, Labor promised that they weren't going to change the goalposts on super. The Prime Minister was unambiguous on that, absolutely unambiguous on that. And now he wants to change the rules. This is Australians' money. That should be the starting point. Of course, Labor starts from a different point of view, which is that it's their money. It's for them to tax it as they see fit. And we heard that in spades from Jim Chalmers. The other point about this, Kieran, is this will just be the beginning. They are talking about raising $1 billion from this, but they added $115 billion in the October budget, and who knows how much more in this next budget. Labor's coming after Australians' money because they don't have enough of their own. That's what we've typically seen from Labor in the past, and I'm very confident this is just the beginning. But the reality of this particular kite that's been flown, and Chalmers couldn't answer the most basic questions on how it would work in that interview, but the reality of it is it's a broken election promise, another broken election promise alongside electricity prices and cheaper mortgages and so on, a long list now.
Is your case undermined, though, by the fact that the last time there were changes to the system was under the Turnbull government with Scott Morrison as Treasurer, and they actually went further than what the Labor government's floating at the moment? Well,
the reality is that we didn't make the election promise that they did before this election. I mean, there's no ambiguity about this. The Prime Minister made it very clear to Australians. Now, he made it very clear on a number of things, what he was going to do after the election. But it seems that Labor says one thing before an election, something quite different afterwards, and that's a real breach of trust with the Australian people, Kieran, and this really matters. But as I say, and John Howard has rightly said, and he said this of his own volition, he wasn't willed out. I don't think John Howard would take kindly to the comments that we've just heard from Jim Chalmers, but the point he made is this will just be the beginning for Labor. They're coming after your money. They love to tax. I mean, what Jim Chalmers didn't talk about in that interview is the extra $45 billion of sneaky spending that they've put through or they're putting through the Parliament as we speak. Which is extra spending that he's going to want to fund through higher taxes on Australians. And this particular tax, which is as yet still very poorly defined, I'd have to say, but this particular tax, I'm sure, is just the beginning. We'll see more as we approach the May budget. Our money is Labor's honey. We heard it from the Assistant Treasurer this week. That's how they're thinking about it. They've got very sticky fingers, this government. They want to come after your money.
Why did the coalition move, though, on some of the concessions back in 2016-17? Do you see some of the arguments around needing to make it sustainable, the concessions in the super system?
Well, the sustainability that Jim Chalmers is talking about is the sustainability of his spending habit. I mean, $115 billion extra dollars at the last budget, $45 billion of off-budget spending that we've opposed. We've just said it's just not the right time. We've got inflationary pressures, we've got interest rate pressures, something that he doesn't seem to want to talk about if he can avoid it. And in fact, having said it was his highest priority, he spent the whole week talking about taxing people more for their superannuation. So, look, the reality of this situation is they made an election promise. They're clearly, like many of their election promises, going to run away from it. And more broadly, there's a real sustainability problem with their spending intentions, and we heard absolutely nothing about managing their spending in that interview with Jim Chalmers that we've just heard.
If there were to be a cap on concessions of, say, $3 or $4 million balances, would that be seen as a major change or a tweak that affects 36,000 people or 36,000
Well, breaking an election promise is a major change. Yeah, Kieran, look, breaking an election promise is a major change. That's the point. And you can't disassociate this issue from that context. That they made the commitment. The Prime Minister was very, very clear about this. Albanese seems to think it's okay to say one thing before an election, win the election, and say something quite different afterwards. And that context hugely important. As to the merits of a change like this, I mean, it's completely undefined at this point. How do you deal with defined benefit schemes? How do you deal with unlisted assets? How do you deal with indivisible assets? Is it on withdrawals? Is it on income? Is it on inputs? I mean, Chalmers himself couldn't answer that question. So all of that is ill-defined. But I'll tell you one thing that is absolutely clear. This was a promise. It was made by Labor. Labor spent $115 billion extra in the October budget, and no doubt there'll be more coming at the next budget. And they're coming after Australians' money to pay for all of that. And they see it as their money. I mean, you even heard in his description of superannuation then. They created it, so they seem to feel that they can come after it. And I don't think Australians agree with this. I think Australians' starting point with superannuation is it's their money. And that is a fundamental principle, which means there has to be great caution in moving the goalposts, particularly when you've committed to do otherwise.
To pick up on something you mentioned earlier, John Howard did say this is very unsettling to Middle Australia. He said that to the Weekend Australian. You heard what the Treasurer said in response. Is it fair, though, if a politician, current or former, enters the fray in a political debate, that they're going to receive a return of serve?
Sure, but I mean, I think the point that Jim Chalmers made is he tried to argue that John Howard was willed out. John Howard doesn't get willed out. John Howard decides to say what he thinks, and he said it very clearly. I mean, John Howard is a big believer in Middle Australia, in the wisdom of Middle Australia, in their desire to make sure they're not paying unnecessary tax, in their desire to make sure governments are managing their spending. He's always believed in these things, and he's made that very clear in the last 24 hours, and good on him. I agree with him very strongly.
The Treasurer was also quite forceful in pushing back against the notion that the Labor's protecting its own patch via the super funds, and senior Labor figures have positions in a number of those funds on boards. He says that those boards are reflective of a broader constituency, including business representatives. Isn't that a fair defence?
Well, look, what Labor's proposing this week is far more than just tax increases on superannuation. We know that they've said on many occasions, and in changing the objectives, which was how this debate started, they want superannuation investing in their pet projects, and no doubt those pet projects will be aligned with the interests of union leaders. We've also seen union leaders wanting to make sure that there's not transparency in the way superannuation funds spend their money. And in fact, Labor has tried valiantly in the Parliament to prevent that transparency from occurring, and that would mean that people can see if their fund is giving money to the Labor Party. They'd get complete transparency on that. Labor's tried to stop all of that. So this is a broader agenda for Labor, and it is aligned with the union bosses. It is aligned with those who contributed greatly to their last election, and frankly, for Labor to say that this is not part of their alignment with the unions and their attempt to support the unions in return for the donations they get, I mean, I think it's a very hard line for them to pull.
The other issue I want to ask you about today is the cashless debit card. The government has said that there have been problems in a number of these communities that have used the cashless debit card for a long time prior to it becoming voluntary at the end of last year. The local Shire Mayor in Laverton in WA and in Leonora as well, other communities are saying that it's having a dire impact. But do you concede the fact that it's been made voluntary, the cashless debit card, is just one of the factors, with the symptoms having a much deeper cause behind them all?
Oh, well, look, it's a terrible situation. We've seen the rivers of grog starting up again in these areas, and, incredibly disappointing. I know our local members and representatives across the areas where this has been happening are incredibly distressed about it. But the point was that this was put in place with the consent of the local leadership, and that local leadership is clearly upset. We've got mayors who are not happy with the situation. Their voice is not being heard, Kieran. Let's be clear about this, and they've been very clear on this on multiple occasions. And I think that's very disappointing to the local members in those and representatives in those areas. They want to see better outcomes on the ground in those communities, make no mistake about it. And sadly, this is a step in the wrong direction.
So what needs to happen then, in your view?
Well, I mean, we've been very clear about this. We think the cashless debit card should remain. I mean, no ambiguity about that. But most importantly, Labor should listen to those local leaders. I mean, they talk about wanting to listen to the voice, but what about the local leaders in those communities? And those local leaders have made their views very, very clear. And it's time for Labor to listen to that.
Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor, live from Goulburn. Thanks for your time. Appreciate it.
Good on you. Thanks, Kieran.